we've been on the track of the Yellowstone hotspot, so we've been in exotic places like Burley. He said, this year we're going to go to Jackson Hole. And I'd never been here. And I said, I don't want to go to Jackson Hole. I'm going to miss the state swim meet. I mean, you don't know what you're making me do. And so, but I remember driving over the pass and seeing the Tetons and thinking, oh, well, this isn't going to be so bad. So anyway, then of course, I'm sure most of you are familiar, John and my dad authored a great book on the geology of Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks, and then also a book with Dave Love and others on the creation of the Teton landscape. So I've been out here a lot during my life, and I sure wish I would have paid more attention to what my dad was doing in the field, but I eventually caught on. He's continuing his work still today. Here he's collecting some cosmogenic samples to better constrain the timing of glaciation in the Tetons. And he's continued work with, this is one of my master's students, and then Tammy Rittenauer out in the Lost River Range. And this was back in, I think, 2007 on this particular trip. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening, and the undergrads were all exhausted, and the grad students were exhausted. And my dad is saying, we can't stop until we get to the top of this next hill, because we need to see if it's a moraine. So anyway, but back to the subject of fires. Here's a couple of photos that a friend sent me who happened to be flying overhead. I'm not exactly sure where this fire was. It looks like it's around near Mount Leidy. But this region, and certainly all of you in this room, if you're living in the West, you are living with fire. Fire activity has been increasing since about the mid-1980s. So of course the Yellowstone fires in '88 really put an exclamation point on this. Whoops, sorry, I hit the wrong button. Here we have area burned in millions of hectares in the U.S. And we've got ups and downs. Last year was a pretty cool, wet summer. We didn't have too many large fires in Idaho and Wyoming. But the burn area is increasing. Over 9 million acres in 2012 in the United States, 1.7 million of those acres in Idaho, which makes it the largest burn area of any state at that time. And here we have the projections for the Yellowstone region. This is from Tony Westerling's work. This dotted line here shows the 1988 burn area, and it's real hard to see here, so I don't want you to try to squint and see all these lines, but the blue shows the actual acres burned, and these are our projections. This is 2050. This upper line is also important. This shows the total vegetated area in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Okay, so the projections are that pretty much everything is going to burn. Now, this is a model, right? And I was just speaking with a gentleman earlier and saying, models, you gotta know what goes into the models. And here we are putting in factors into an unknown future. So, but this is a little scary. This was the Beaver Creek fire outside of Haley, Idaho, 2013. So lots of questions about fire. One thing I'm going to talk about here at the beginning and kind of tie this to the end is some policy issues related to fire. Are these, first of all, are these recent fires, so starting again in about the mid-1980s, really extraordinary? Or do we see records of very fiery times in the Earth's past? So that's what I have been doing, and my students have been doing, has been looking at past records of forest fires. Are these large fires fueled by prior fire suppression and land management? And what is the role of climate? So can we particularly use these past records to inform future management of our forests? And then thinking a little bit about that slide about the burn area in Yellowstone, are we facing a future of type transition? Meaning, are we going to transition from lodgepole pine forest to shrublands? Are we going to transition from ponderosa pine forests to pinyon pine forests? And how will that work? Some background here, a colleague of mine, Tom Swetnam, has compiled some really neat Smokey the Bear posters. This is one of the early ones, and I'll let you guys look at these. You know, death rides in the forest when man is careless. Forests are vital to national defense. Careless matches aid the Axis, so back in the war era. So invoking, you know, politics and fire, God and fire, that shalt not destroy thy forests. God gave us this, you know, with Bambi. Don't you give us this, you know. And many, many cute, pathetic-looking animals in burned forests. All part of the Smokey the Bear era of fire suppression. So throughout these posters and throughout the American mentality is this idea that we can control fire. If we don't start fires, fires won't happen. That's the message of these posters. Now that, of course, has led to another era of fire and management. This new era states, well, because of fire suppression during the, you know, active suppression really started maybe in the 1950s, you know, when we had more roads, airplanes, helicopters, mechanized means of trying to suppress fires. So that fire suppression era, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, has led to a buildup of fuels in our landscape. And that buildup of fuels is what is fueling these large fires. Okay, so that's one of the main questions we're going to be looking at today. So is prior fire suppression during the Smokey the Bear era, is that what's fueling our large fires in our landscape? And I would argue no. So Yellowstone, that's a great example. What active fire suppression occurred in Yellowstone? None, right? I mean, so it was a national park. There wasn't active fire suppression going on in Yellowstone. In Idaho, the Frank Church Wilderness area, no active, effective fire suppression. And yet both of these areas have seen very large standard placing fires in recent times. So there must be something else, right? And I joke with people that I went to school for 12 years to tell you this. You ready? Fires are bigger and they're more severe when it's warm and dry. There you go, right? Climate. Climate plays a large role in fires, particularly longer fire seasons, earlier snowmelt, and severe summer drought. Okay, so that's the lion in the room. What I've done is look through the past to see are these large fires a part of different ecosystems, in particular ponderosa pines, these drier forest types. And what we find is evidence of these large fires in the past. So in case you nod off during the rest of the talk, I'm giving you the results now, which is that these records do not support the inference that megafires result from fire suppression. And again, these recent large fires also correspond with warmer climate and severe drought. Finally, and I don't have a good answer for this one, even though fire is a natural part of our ecosystems, will our forests and rangelands recover given the new boundary conditions of what many scientists are terming the Anthropocene? So the era of new and human-influenced life on Earth. So this is my fire triangle. So what I'm looking at is the interaction and role that climate plays in driving fire activity, how fire and changes in vegetation interact over different time periods. So of course fire disturbs vegetation, but vegetation dictates the type of fire regime you may have in a particular landscape. And then finally I'm talking about geomorphic response. Now John set this up very nicely by defining geomorphology for you, but in this particular case I'm looking at how does the landscape respond to fire, and in particular I'm looking at fire-related erosion. So I'm going to focus on a couple of different areas here. This is work that a student of mine, Carrie Riley, did as part of her master's thesis, and poor Carrie had to spend months of her summer rafting down the Middle Fork of the Salmon River and collecting samples. And the only way to get to her sites really was by raft for any practical purposes. So it worked out well for me because she was a former guide on the Middle Fork. So I don't know. She taught me a lot about rafting, and maybe I taught her a lot about geomorphology. So as I mentioned before, there have been very large standard placing fires along the Middle Fork. The upper elevations are characterized by subalpine and mixed conifer forests, and the lower elevations are sagebrush, steppe, and open conifers. So a very wide range of ecosystems. I'll also be talking about work that I did for my PhD along the South Fork of the Payette River. Here's Spence Wood down here for scale. Here's an example of a very large geomorphic response to fire. This is a colluvial failure, and this happens 7 to 10 years following a fire when your root strength declines. If the soil becomes saturated, there's much less cohesion on that slope, and that can result in these very large failures. This particular one happened during the 96-97 winter. The other typical geomorphic response to fire is overland flow and rilling. So this happens very soon after a fire when you have a burned slope, and that reduction, again, in vegetation and the development of these water-repellent soils acts to prevent water from entering the soil, and you get overland flow, meaning that the water is actually flowing over the surface and collecting soil particles as it goes. All of these can lead to very large debris flows, and I'll have some pictures of those in a minute. The third area, this is an area where another one of my master's students, also named Carrie, they were there at the same time, which made things very confusing. So Carrie and Carrie. The other Carrie Whitner, did a great project at the City of Rocks. Who's been to the City of Rocks? It's a great place. If you're interested in geology, or climbing, it's a great place to go. So she was looking at fire records in this Pinyon-juniper woodland. So I said I'd talk a little bit about these modern debris flows. Here are some examples. But of course, as in all geologic studies, the present is the key to the past. In order to understand these past records of fire, we need to look at modern records. And what we find, fairly unequivocally, is that fire increases erosion. Okay, so on a recently burned slope, a kind of run-of-the-mill storm, your 1-year, 2-year summer storm, can produce a very major erosional response. So that's a very important thing to remember. Here is a home that has been buried in a post-fire debris flow. Here's an example of some debris flows in the Greenhorn Gulch area of Idaho. You can see these nice levees that have been built up in this Idaho batholith granitic rock. And you can see some rilling quite clearly on this slope, and little mini levees down here. So these debris flows are a very powerful agent of erosion in burned landscapes. Another example, so those were pretty non-bouldery debris flows that I just showed you. That's because there weren't any boulders to move. Okay? Here, this is along the main fork of the Payette River tributary called Zimmer Creek. You see a very bouldery debris flow emanating from this recently burned basin. Again, fairly run-of-the-mill storm event, nothing spectacular, but it did produce spectacular results. So what we do is look at these evidence of past debris flows in the geologic record. So here we have an example of a stratigraphic section and an alluvial fan. These alluvial fans provide somewhat leaky, but good recorders of geomorphic events over time. So they're built up at the base of slopes. When these debris flows flow down, they deposit material on these alluvial fans. And here we have a record from the, this one's from the Middle Fork of the Salmon, extending back 6,500 years, showing some fire-related sheet floods in the mid-Holocene, a fairly thick debris flow, a very thick debris flow from about 2,800 years ago, right here, another thinner debris flow. The magnitude of this geomorphic response can also be used as a metric of the burn severity. If you have a patchy burn that does not burn all your trees, oftentimes you'll get, again, an erosional response, but not as big, right? So what we found from studying modern events is that oftentimes you'll get these sheet flooding events, which are these pulsating flow events, following more moderate fires, and large debris flows following extensive standard placing fires. We also then combine these records of fire. Again, remember, vegetation is a key part of that triangle. We need to know what burned. That's important. So we look at these wood fragments that we find, and I forgot to mention those ages are from radiocarbon dating of that wood. So we look at the wood fragments we find to try to identify what burned. We work with paleoecologists like Kathy Whitlock to combine our records with her records of vegetation change from lakes. And this is actually Julio Betancourt, many of you know him. He's also a paleoecologist. This is his son, who's a theater major, but we made him climb up and gather this pack rat midden. This is what Carrie Wepner used at the City of Rocks. Those pack rats do what their name implies. They go and gather things from around their nest, pieces of vegetation. And you can actually use these records going back 40,000, 50,000 years to reconstruct climate. They pile up this vegetation and they poop and pee on it, and it turns into something that we call amber. But it actually doesn't, this may be a little too much information, but it has a very unique but not bad smell. It kind of smells like old cigars or something like that. I don't know. So interesting experience climbing up rocks at the City of Rock to collect these wood rat middens. I put an ad out in our outdoor center to solicit good climbers, and they had a fun summer. They didn't quite know what they were getting in for. All right. So here we have a lot of squiggly lines, so bear with me for just a few minutes while I try to explain this. So each of these is from a different place. There's City of Rocks. This is near Boise. Middle Fork, lower elevation, South Fork Payette, Sawtooth, Middle Fork. All of these show the sum of those calibrated radiocarbon ages. So unfortunately, when we date these pieces of radiocarbon, it doesn't give us, one exact year. We can't say, oh, a fire burned 2,554 years ago. Rather, it gives us a statistical range of ages, saying, it'd be like me saying, well, I'm 40 years old plus or minus 10 years. Right? So that's the type of ages we get back for these fires. We take all those ages that we get and we add them up, and we come up with these distributions. So, for example, right here, we can see that there's a fairly fiery time about 500 years ago in many of these records. Again, around 1,000 years ago. So these peaks are showing peaks in fire activity over time. So we do see some correspondence with these. These are both of our kind of more arid areas, showing a peak about 500 years ago. This actually corresponds with the Little Ice Age, a time characterized by cooler and wetter climates than today. But let's think about what type of environment we're in. We're in sagebrush steppe and mixed sagebrush and juniper. So these are generally fuel-limited systems. So in these systems, if you have 20 years, 50 years, 100 years of wet and cool conditions where you could grow fuels, then you have 5 years of drought. That can produce large fires, and that is what we're seeing here. In some of our higher elevation settings, we generally see peaks around 900 to 1,000 years ago. This is a time called the medieval climatic anomaly, a time characterized by very variable climates and also severe droughts. Whoops. Another interesting piece here is our pines. So believe it or not, I'm sure all of you in this room have spent a lot of time hiking and enjoying the national parks and forests in this region. And it's hard to imagine, these higher elevation places without, say, lodgepole pine. But lodgepole pine was not always on these landscapes. And nor was ponderosa pine. Ponderosa pine, from what we can tell, arrived in the South Fork Payette Basin around 4,000 years ago. So these pines are fairly, rather newcomers. Doug fir has been around for a long time, but what our paleoecological studies are telling us is that these pines have only arrived fairly recently. Kathy Whitlock's work from the Sawtooth shows that lodgepole pine only arrived about 2,700 years ago. So if we look at the records from near her study, we can see certainly an increase in fire after the arrival of lodgepole pine. I can't really put a gold stamp on that and say lodgepole pine is what is driving this fire activity, because of course as we go further and further back in time, the records get harder and harder to interpret. If I'm digging through an alluvial fan, it gets harder and harder to dig deeper to find those older records. But these fire-prone pines and their arrival on our landscape has made a difference. Work with Julio Betancourt at the City of Rocks shows that pinyon expanded enormously only about 700 years ago. This is at the northernmost extent of pinyon pine on our landscape, and it hasn't been there for that long. What will be interesting is to see what happens in the future. So trees can't fly, right? Like birds. They have to slowly kind of expand and march out across the landscape. Is climate changing faster than our trees can march? Should we be helping them? Should we be helping pinyon move to, say, Boise? And then we get into very tricky management situations. So I talked a little bit about these two intervals in the past, and I'm going to revisit this quickly. I talked about what I'd like to rename the medieval variable period, the MVP, for which the Bucks, not the Ducks, would get in the college playoff, right? It's funny, I did go to University of Oregon, but my husband's and his entire family are diehard Buckeye fans, so I think it's better for my well-being that they won, actually. But getting back to climate, so here we have this time about 1,000 years ago, characterized by severe multi-decadal droughts and prolonged wet periods. Now, if you want a perfect recipe for large fires, have 10, 20 years of wet, cooler times where you can grow fuels, and then severe drought to burn those fuels. That's exactly what we had. Grant Meyer, has Grant ever given a talk for this group?
No.
Oh, you should invite him up. He's done some amazing work on fire history, beaver in Yellowstone. He's done some really neat stuff. He was my advisor at when I was at the University of New Mexico. He found that this time was a time of peak fire in Yellowstone, again about 1,000 years ago. I also found this to be a time of peak fire in the South Fork of the Payette. This is some more squiggly lines from my work in the South Fork Payette. Here's this medieval climatic anomaly, so showing these large, severe debris flows during this time. The gray undershading also shows peak fire activity in Yellowstone. So we kind of have two different regimes going on here. Many of these records here in the South Fork Payette were from the higher elevations, areas that were usually too wet to burn, but they burned then, and they burned severely, and they burned ponderosa pine forests. So this idea that large stand replacing fires should not be a part of our ponderosa pine system is not correct. This is not supported by our evidence. So large severe fires are rare, but they are a part of our ponderosa pine ecosystems. Now this top graph shows more what I was talking about when I was talking about those sagebrush steppe ecosystems. This shows a very large peak during the Little Ice Age, again a time characterized by cooler climates than today. But the geomorphic response to those fires was quite different. When I dig through those fans and I date those pieces of charcoal, what I find is that these pieces of charcoal from the Little Ice Age are mostly in these thin sheet flood deposits. Again, indicating a low geomorphic response, and from our modern studies, characterized less severe fires. So certainly fires during the Little Ice Age, but not fires in Yellowstone, and potentially less severe fires in the South Fork Payette. So to summarize this, so geomorphic response is a clue to fire severity. If you have a wet climate, this increases vegetation density on your landscape, increases slope stability, soil development, and storage of sediment, right? So if you have a thick, healthy forest that's storing sediment on your steep hill slopes, if that slope burns, you've dramatically decreased your vegetation density. These are often prone to very severe fires. They don't burn often, but when they do, they burn big. With that large amount of stored sediment, you can produce these large debris flows. You also have a lot of ash and silt and clay. This also promotes debris flows on these landscapes. In drier climates, or say south-facing slopes, the decreased vegetation density on these slopes promotes more frequent sheet flooding events. So less soil development, less storage, more frequent erosional events. So that decreased vegetation density also generally decreases fire severity on those slopes, so your fires are less severe. So we can use these geomorphic clues as indicators of past fire activity. Interestingly, what Carrie Riley found from the Middle Fork of the Salmon is that in that environment, and especially in those upper basins, a huge percentage, so about 70% of the total fan thickness was related to fire. And she measured sediment yields from recent fire-related debris flows. Basically, the take-home message from this is that fire is the big daddy controlling erosion in these high mountain landscapes. So fire is not only interesting from an ecological perspective, but if we're thinking about what drives erosion on longer time scales in these fire-prone areas, fire may really be a large factor. Okay. What I've been working on recently is trying to compile many records. So this is my students' work. This is Grant's work from Yellowstone. And these are Grant's students who've been working on fire records from the Southwest. I was hoping, that by the time I was going to give this talk, I said, okay, I'm going to give this talk in Jackson, and then by that point, I'll have figured out all these fire records, and then I'll have made sense of all this data. But it didn't quite pan out. So this study is interesting in that it spans, if we're going kind of from the north to the south, and I know you can't read that, a wide variety of ecosystems. So Yellowstone is the end member of the spectrum in that it is generally too wet to burn. Who's tried to start a campfire in the winter, falls, you know what I'm talking about, right? Just try to get a fire going when it's cold and wet. It's pretty hard. So Yellowstone generally too wet to burn except under extreme conditions. Moving into the Middle Fork of the Salmon, South Fork Payette, here's our sagebrush steppe in the Snake River Plain, into the pinyon pine ecosystems of City of Rocks, pinyon, ponderosa, Doug fir, the Four Corners, and then down into the Flagstaff area of Arizona. So lots of different records. And it's proving more difficult than I thought to figure out. So this is just the last 3,000 years. The first challenge was getting them all graphed on the same page. So, so I'm not going to try to explain all of these squiggles, but suffice it to say that all of these areas have experienced times of widespread fire. They don't all synchronize, so we're not seeing necessarily times where there's fires throughout every ecosystem. And that makes sense, right? We're looking at a variety of climates and a variety of ecosystems. So, but I am trying to piece apart that data. But the end message from this part of the talk, when you look at 1,000-year timescales, and if you look at records of climate and fire, and you'll have to take my word on this in terms of the climate records, but again, times like the medieval climatic anomaly, where many other independent records show severe drought and high climate variability. That combination of climate variability promoting vegetation growth with multi-decadal droughts produce large debris flows and inferred standard placing fires in a range of ecosystems, including ponderosa, Doug fir, lodgepole, pinyon. Now let's bring this back to the present. I would argue that yes, our recent fires are a result of fuel buildup on our landscapes. But what I would say is that fuel has been building up for not decades, but hundreds of years. So again, in general, until the we had our Dust Bowl era drought. We had the large fires of 1910. But, throughout the Little Ice Age, forests, and again, the arrival of our fire-prone pines on our landscape. So remember, these pines are relatively recent arrivals in the West, have built up fuel throughout a range of ecosystems. So now we have the climate conditions that are perfect for fire. We have lots of fuel, and we have a dry and variable climate. Some evidence of that variability. This is a PhD student's work. He reconstructed the timing of snowmelt, and this is in Idaho, in this throughout Idaho, showing final snowmelt dates. So, surprise, surprise, snow is melting earlier, and you see the same trend when you look at all the watersheds in Idaho. As you can tell from this graph, and then certainly from this graph, the timing of snowmelt is getting more and more erratic. So this blue line shows the 10-year average standard deviation in the timing of snowmelt. So now we're looking at plus or minus over 20 days. For the water managers in Idaho, this is a nightmare, right? So how can you predict how much water to hold back if the timing of your snowmelt is changing so much year to year? So, so our modern evidence shows that we have this late Holocene development of fuel loads. We had generally wet and cool conditions from the 1960s through the 80s. We have a lot of anthropogenic warming, okay? Severe drought in the western US, longer fire seasons. And I know some of your previous speakers may have talked about this. So the fire season is indeed getting longer. Snow is melting earlier. Droughts are more severe. 2014 was the warmest year on record. Finally, we've had the introduction of invasive species, plus human ignition. And I will certainly say that prior fire suppression has played a role in some areas. I'm not saying that everywhere in the western US that has not had an effect. So just wrapping this up with a few words about our rangeland systems. So this is showing burn areas in the western US, just 1981 to 2013. You can see why I moved to Idaho to study fires, right? So there's no shortage of fires, usually, in Idaho. And in particular, though, I want to zoom in on the Snake River Plain. So here we have the Snake River Plain here. There's Rexburg. You guys are right off the map over here. And you can see these very large fires in our previously sagebrush steppe ecosystems. So anyone know what the primary plant is in the Snake River Plain now? Not sagebrush.
Cheatgrass.
Cheatgrass. Very good. Cheatgrass. So cheatgrass loves fire. And unfortunately, we've gotten into this cycle of ignition, burning of sagebrush steppe. That sagebrush is replaced by cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is an annual grass. Sagebrush takes years to regerminate. The cheatgrass can germinate right away. And it is more than happy to burn every year and come back every year. It greens up earlier than any other plant on the landscape. It dries out earlier, and it produces this continuous carpet of fuel in areas where our paleoecologic studies show that the sagebrush did not used to burn that frequently, maybe once every 400 years. So fire is actually not typically a big part of this ecosystem. This is also where we come into play. This is an example, the Murphy Complex fire, over 600,000 acres. Mike Pellant, who's with the BLM, took this photo. He said when he started his job in the 70s, fires over 100,000 acres were unheard of in BLM lands. Now they're typical. So large increase in fire in our sagebrush steppe ecosystems. A few snippets from effectiveness of prescribed burns. Some studies show that prescribed fires do help reduce the severity of subsequent fires. So I don't want you to leave this talk and say, well, Jen told me that prescribed fires don't help at all. Well, some areas they do. Studies have shown that. Other areas, they don't. Wally Covington, who had perhaps the most extensive area that they had thinned out, taken out snag, shrubs, everything from one sector of a forest, left the other sector intact. The whole thing burned. So anyone who's been around a fire, I was here during the 88 fires, our cabin almost burned down. Once these fires get big enough, they will burn anything. Getting back to those rangeland ecosystems for a moment, all these dots are lightning-started fires, 86 through 96, and human-started fires. The big difference here in terms of what we're doing to change fire regimes are in areas that are not typically characterized by lightning. Jackson, sorry, you're out of luck. You've got tons of lightning. You can, try to limit human ignitions as much as you can, but you will always have that factor. Snake River Plain is not characterized by as much lightning. Areas like the Willamette Valley, in Oregon, hardly any lightning strikes. So this is where I think we actually can make a difference, is trying to limit our human-started fires. Many of these fires are started in the fall. So times when we normally don't have these big convective storms with lightning, but we have very dry vegetation. These are the times when we really need to be worried about human-started fires. If you weren't kind of depressed already, here's something else to depress you. This kind of has a vague sounding title, Temperature as a Potent Driver of Regional Forest Drought Stress and Tree Mortality. But this is a very important paper. This is an ecologist, which has basically shown that when you look at the moisture requirements of our forests, we are not going to be able to provide enough moisture to keep these trees healthy. So whether they die from fire or insect infestations or whatever else, it's becoming too warm and dry to keep our forests alive in many areas. I mean, what happens when you don't water your houseplants? So even if we're getting, our precipitation isn't changing that much. So in Idaho, future climate projections indicate that the amount of precipitation isn't going to change all that much. Those climate projections also show that the amount of moisture we're going to get in the summer will be less, okay? That's when everything's growing, or trying to grow. It's also going to be warmer. So even if we kept the exact same amount of moisture in the summer, if it's warmer, we have more evapotranspiration, and therefore more stress on our plants. So the outlook, I think, is particularly grim for, this is the distribution of ponderosa pine in the western US in gray. This is the Tony Westerling's work showing forest susceptibility to changes in the timing of snowmelt. So you can see that many of our ponderosa pine systems are at risk. And this is where we are. Okay. So this is going to be a big, big issue. It already is, right, in this area. To wrap things up, millennial scale records do show that fire has been a part of many different diverse ecosystems over thousands of years. What we haven't found, and unfortunately our radiocarbon, the era in our radiocarbon ages doesn't really allow us to do this, but what we haven't found are times when everything is burning. When we look back at the sediment record from our time, right now, from the mid-1980s until now, you're going to find a lot of charcoal. And it's all going to date to about the same time. So maybe, my great-great-granddaughter can take a look at that. Our recent fires correspond with a markedly warmer climate and severe drought. So no big surprise there. Even though fire is a natural part of our ecosystems, will our forests and rangelands recover? I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. And what should we be doing to try to help them? I think that, collecting those seeds, retaining that genetic diversity in our forests and rangelands is very important, because you never know which species is going to take hold in the future. So keeping our ecosystems as intact as possible and keeping our corridors between those ecosystems as intact as possible, I think is a good place to start. To really conclude, I've been concluding for 5 minutes now, right? Why do we identify prior management as the driver of these mega fires? So, when I give a talk like this to the Forest Service, this is not what they are taught generally in the management community, right? So why is it, and even, front page of the New York Times Magazine last year said, we're entering this era of mega fires due to prior fire suppression. So why is that still, being talked about as the major cause instead of climate? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that, climate and climate change is still a debated topic in some areas, even though scientific consensus is clear. The other one is that we want to do something, right? We want to do something to stop these fires. So if these fires are something that we have created by prior management, then that means that we can do something about it, right? If we thin enough, if we have enough prescribed burns, then maybe we can solve this problem. We need to fight fires more. We need to do a better job fighting fires. That's another rather tragic issue in our country. So 19 firefighters died in Yarnell, Arizona, because we essentially threw them into the eye of a hurricane. This idea that humans can stop these large standard-placing fires is not true. Okay, we can stop the little ones. We're good at putting out the little ones. We're good at protecting our communities. We can do that. But stopping these large standard-placing fires, anyone know what stopped the Yellowstone fires? Snow, exactly. So we need to stop thinking of fire as something that we can control. So Again, we messed it up, so maybe we can fix it. Fires are disturbing. I don't like seeing burned forests either. I don't like thinking about these displaced and killed animals, people, communities. And the management creates jobs and revenue. A lot of my students work as firefighters in the summer. So, anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I know I went over, so thank you for sitting patiently.
So, comments or questions?
There's forests that have fire versus forests that are clear cut. Are there differences in the erosion? And also, is there difference in carbon dioxide loss of uptake when you lose it from either reason?
That's a great question. So, so clear-cut forests, you certainly have loss of that root strength. So the main studies that have been done on this have been from the Pacific Northwest, so Oregon, Washington, and what they've shown very conclusively is that clear-cutting increases erosion, and especially from those saturation failures, like feedback or something, like the one where I showed that little tiny person. So when you have real saturating storms that saturate your hill slopes, and you've lost those trees, if you lose the trees, whether by fire or clear cutting, you lose the cohesion from those roots as those roots die. So that will increase erosion, whether by fire or by clear cutting. What fire, though, does is immediately after fire, if you have a very severely burned area like Yellowstone, the effects of the ash, so you have ash, and then you have this fire-induced water repellency, which occurs in the soil. So that heating of the soil surface actually, and then burning of those waxy substances in the plants produces a water repellent layer. So you are more likely to get the rilling, so overland flow and rilling from burned areas instead of clear cuts. You don't normally see that from clear cuts. So both of them increase erosion. Fire increases erosion via those two mechanisms, clear cutting usually only through the saturation failure type mechanism. Your second question about the carbon sequestration is really interesting. So of course, fires emit a lot of carbon when they burn as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When you clear cut something, then that wood is sold and bought, and maybe some of it is being used to build our house right now. And so is that, so that's a way maybe to sequester carbon. So that the fate of that carbon is less certain. So good question.
Yeah, your comment about the movement of the trees going from Doug firs to ponderosa, different pines all the way to lodgepole. What was really the driver of the trees coming into this area? Do you have a good understanding of that? And a second question kind of about the trees is there's always been this discussion, especially in Colorado, of the pine bark beetle infestation. And you didn't say anything about, is that a cause, what's causing that, and is that a contributing factor?
Two great questions. So the tree expansion is fascinating, and so one reason those trees are expanding, for example, the pinyon pine arriving at City of Rocks is post-glacial vegetation expansion. So when the glaciers were sitting over Canada and lapping down into the United States, and big ice caps sitting over Yellowstone, all our the vegetation effectively got kind of transferred south. So we had more kind of tundra steppe environments here, and so part of it is just taking time for those trees to kind of march back northward. So that's what's happening with the pinyon. In other cases, the ponderosa is an interesting question, because I think that the ponderosa we have in Idaho is the Pacific ponderosa, so that means it would have been coming more from Oregon. However, there's another subspecies of ponderosa in the Dakotas, and sure where that had come from a refugia. But it hadn't really, the interesting part is that, and what would be neat if Kathy could pick it out from her pollen records is to find whether the lodgepole was here during the last interglacial or not. So your second question about bark beetle, that's a great question. So bark beetle is a native species. It hasn't been introduced from anywhere. So we also have records of past bark beetle infestations that have been found from Lake Corps records. The bark beetle fire interaction is complicated and a little bit counterintuitive. So when you see a beetle-infested forest, and especially when the needles are still on, that forest certainly is prone to fire. However, once the needles drop off, the studies that have been done, and they've done some experimental work at Colorado State University, and what they've shown is that those forests are a little bit less likely to burn than a living forest that's dry with its needles. So that once those trees drop their needles, there's, you've got lots of fuel on the forest floor, but you have less fuel in the canopy to carry those fires. So the beetles are, both beetles and fire are promoted by warmer climates, and especially warmer winters. If you get temperatures less than -15, I think is a cutoff, that can kill the beetle larvae. However, if it doesn't get that cold, then they can survive and have multiple reproductive cycles.
Is the Ditch Creek fan caused by fire? Is that what you're saying? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
It's an erosional fan coming out of the Grovon Mountains. There's a couple of them up there.
Oh, that's a huge fan.
Yeah, now is that primarily from, what is it
No,
caused
so that fan so you get alluvial fans throughout the world in lots of different settings. And you get fans formed when you have a break and slope from a steep area and then a wide expanse. So Jackson Hole has just gorgeous fans. A lot of them around here, if you had a valley glacier occupying, and I'm not sure about the Ditch Creek fan. That again is just your break and slope plus lots of sediment being transported by that stream and deposited where it loses energy. You also get fans around here that form if you have a U-shaped valley carved out by glaciers, and then the glaciers recede, you can get lots of little post-glacial fans that extend into that nice expansion space. So, John?
I don't know if this was ever published, but right after the '88 fires, some guys came in and cored trees that didn't burn in the fire to find out when there was a fire as severe as the '88 fire. It was back in the 1700s.
Yep, and that doesn't surprise me. There were some severe droughts in the middle of the Little Ice Age that I think caused a lot of fires. So, little side note, I was just talking with John before. So this is John Good. If you don't know him, my dad spent 10 years, working with John every summer out in the field. And so John had the pleasure of enjoying my company during my teenage years on horsepacking trips and backpacking trips and days where the option was, hang out around the, Moose Forest Service housing or the Park Service housing, or go out and do whatever fun thing John and my dad were doing in the field. So, and you always had much better lunches than my dad. Maybe thanks to Edna.
You said one of the things we can do is retain intact ecosystems. Could you explain that a little more, what you mean by that?
Well, I think,
Could you repeat that question?
okay, so great question. The question is about retaining intact ecosystems and what that means. From what I would say is an intact ecosystem is functioning well. So whether that's a sagebrush ecosystem or a lodgepole ecosystem where you have diversity of plants, fungi, bacteria, animals that are adapted to that ecosystem living there still. And that you have a lot of genetic diversity in your plants, bacteria, fungi, and animals occupying that landscape. So that I would say that the Snake River Plain, and especially areas that have been infested by cheatgrass, is an example of an ecosystem that is not doing well. You know, it's almost a monoculture of cheatgrass. It's largely displaced the sagebrush, and you don't have a diversity of flora and fauna there. And I think lots of people would have different definitions, but that would be my definition of an intact ecosystem. So what that brings to the table is the possibility in a warmer, drier climate for a variety of species that are there now to potentially succeed. Our whitebarks, it's not looking good for our whitebarks. It breaks my heart. What other species do we have in those ecosystems that may succeed? And I have to tell you, looking at its paleoecological records, Doug fir, it hangs on. So it's been around for a long time. And it occupies a lot of different ecosystems. So maybe that'll be one.
Comment on First Nation practices, fire.
Great question. So the question is comment on First Nation practices in fire and using fire as a tool. Our native populations used fire certainly to help clear land and to manage animal populations. And that's been a question in terms of, when you look at these prior records, when I look back 1,000 years ago, how do I know that those weren't, human-started fires? Many of the areas where we're looking at, there weren't large human populations from what we know. And what we found is that, again, just like us, that if you try to start a fire and it's really cold and wet, that fire's not going to do much. But if you start a fire when it's warm and dry, you could have a big fire. Those are usually times, though, when you have enough natural ignitions that you'll still get a fire signal, from natural means. The exception to that is places, again, like the Willamette Valley and possibly the Snake River Plain, where you don't have as many natural ignitions. So if you're in areas where you don't have natural ignitions and you have First Nation populations, that probably did play a larger role. So, good question.
What's the role of fire and lodgepole reproduction?
That's another great question, and John could probably answer that better than I could. But so some types of lodgepole have what are called serotinous cones that only open when they're exposed to high heat. Not all lodgepoles have those serotinous cones, but some of them certainly do. And what that indicates is that this is a species that is adapted to fire. And the way that lodgepole has adapted to fire is that the forest will burn like crazy, and then there'll be a new crop of trees that germinates when those cones open and those seeds are released. Other lodgepole forests are not shown to have the serotinous cones, but you still get good, usually good reproduction following fire. Pretty interesting looking at these different tree species, of course. As you know, if you've ever tried to hike through them, lodgepole grow very close together. They do not have very fire-resistant bark. Ponderosa and Doug fir have fire-resistant bark. They drop their lower limbs as they grow, and that protects them from less severe fires. So you get surface fires were typically in those forests.
You used to figure from 1985 to present, and about the 70s, we really began to cut back on allowing our timber companies to forest, and therefore we've created more fuel. Do you factor into your figures the fact that we have more fuel now because we've reduced our utilization of our forest, and also that increases the food supply for the beetle, since they're not using those trees?
So the areas where we looked are, so again, Yellowstone, the Frank Church Wilderness, City of Rocks are areas where there hadn't been active timber harvest. So those areas hadn't experienced.
The Frank Church had quite a bit, because it wasn't formed until 1980. It wasn't a wilderness.
When you look at the amount of land that was logged, it's fairly small compared to the area of the, and especially along the Middle Fork corridor, just because it's so steep. So not too much logging really in that area. What the other studies have shown in terms of acres burned is that many of these fires are fairly non-discriminate in terms of what they'll burn through. They'll burn through areas that are pristine, areas that have been logged 10 years ago. Of course, if there's been a very recently burned or recently harvested area, you've lost the fuels in those areas. For the pine beetle question, there have been some studies, and I can't remember the exact numbers on tree spacing, showing the magnitude of an outbreak and how that relates to the proximity of the trees, and that there's certainly a relationship there. That if you have trees that are very closely spaced, the beetles can just bounce around from tree to tree, and if they exceed a certain distance, then your outbreak is much more controlled. So that could have an effect there.
I have a silly question, maybe, and that is for seeing smoking. Okay, the Forest Service for a while discontinued smoking. Why?
Why did they discontinue smoking? That's not a silly question, and I don't know the answer. I think that when we realized that fire suppression, especially again of lightning-started fires, really maybe wasn't the best idea, then maybe Smokey took a back burner, so to speak. I'll have to look that up. That is a great question, because you're right. I mean, Smokey, but I think Smokey's back now.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Another question. So the timber companies talk about, they call it salvage logging, beetle killer. Can you talk about what is sort of best environmental practices around that? In other words, they're saying, well, the trees are dead, let's cut them down. Is it better to leave them, cut them down? What does the science say about that?
So there have been some great studies out of Oregon State University and other places on this. And and I actually had a slide on this that I took out. Those ecological studies have shown is that those dead trees provide key habitat for many bird species. So leaving those dead snags is very important for birds and insects. The other thing is that even if you have a dead standing tree and they keep standing for a really long time. I mean, they don't just fall over right away. There's still plenty of trees from '88 that are still standing there, right? And when folks have gone out, scientists have looked at the distributions of germinations of seedlings in those forests, what they found is that those seedlings are very preferentially germinating in the shade of those standing snags, so that those, even though it doesn't seem like much, those standing dead trees are providing key shade for sort of subsequent germination. So.
I have a question. 14,000 years ago to 30 plus, there was, we get glacial period, 130,000 plus glacial period. If you look back at the records you look at, you're trading wet, cooler versus a lot more growth. Is there more fire or less fire in the glacials or in the interglacial periods?
There's most fire at the transitions. Again, that's a great question. So the fieriest periods are at those transitions where you've got those heavy fuel loads, and then you now have this warmer climate. So Kathy Whitlock's work and others have shown that. And then in general, well, I don't know if I can say in general. I mean, so it again depends on, I would say there's more fire in the interglacials, but we don't have long enough records really to say for sure. And again, that would change by ecosystem, so that if you think about what, say the Great Basin is a great example, so Nevada. Middle of Nevada, that is in many places a fuel limited system. It is too dry, and the plants are too sparse to carry a fire. So if you go, and Scott Mensing and others from the University of Nevada have looked in that area, and those places, during glacial times, had trees, they had, they had lots of grasses, lots of sage, and they were characterized by more fire because of those higher fuel loads. So it's a great question. Need to do more studies. That is a very good baby. I'm really, really impressed.
Okay, well, Jen will be here for a little bit while we clean things up, put things away. A couple of quick comments. One is tomorrow, 11 o'clock, members' lunchtime program will be occurring out at the